Hello there, this is Doug Rumbaugh, and this is a laptop. Haha, but you couldn't guess that. Specifically, this is actually a fairly special laptop. It's got a lot of sentimental value. This is a Toshiba Portege Z835 P330 is the model number. And I purchased this back in the summer of 2012 as I was preparing to begin my freshman year in college. So this was actually the laptop that got me through the majority of university. And I recently stumbled across it and decided to open it up and take a look at the inside. And on doing so, I noticed a couple of fairly interesting design elements of this laptop that I wanted to share with you. Before we get to that, though, let's just talk a little bit about what this thing actually has. Now, I believe I paid $800 for this, and the specifications are not really all that great. So the P330 SKU that I have here has 4 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. It's actually in a 2x2 configuration, and we'll take a look at how that's divided up when we open it up. It has a 128 gigabyte solid state drive. It's got an Intel Mobile i3 second generation. I'll insert the model number here for you. It's a dual core, does support hyper-threading though. The display is 1366 by 768 HD, so it's not FHD, it's just standard HD. And I will tell you that when I first moved from HD to Full HD 1080p on a laptop display, the difference was incredible. For some reason, that difference between the 1920 by 1080 and 1366 by 768, it's a huge upgrade to go to the 1080p. So, kind of a humdrum display. In fact, let's just open it up here. As you can see, it's got a decidedly 2012 trackpad with physical buttons, and it's relatively small. The keyboards beat all to crap. That's actually, we'll talk about that. Keyboards all beat to crap. Missing a hinge. There's the display, got webcam, big bezels, blah, blah, blah. It's also a little bit flimsy. A bit. I've seen reading reviews of it that a fairly common failure mode is the display actually snapping. Hi. The display actually snapping on account of it being relatively thin. I used and abused this thing for 3 or 4 years with no issues as far as the display goes, but that is something that I've seen. It is incredibly light. It weighs about 1 kilogram, so a little over 2 pounds. It is 7/10 of an inch thick at the thickest point, so it's also incredibly thin, as you can see there. Now, before we take a look at this too closely on the inside, I want to talk a bit about the ports, because the ports on this thing are very impressive. Now, I don't follow laptops all that closely. I watch occasional Ultrabook reviews and things like that, or I suppose they're called thin and lights now. Same thing, small computers. See, I'm really not that big of a laptop fan. I like desktop computers. I hate being cramped behind a little teeny tiny thing. Plus, it's cheaper to get high performing desktop hardware than laptops. So, for me, in my personal use cases, the laptops that I want are small like this, thin and lights. Now, one trend that I'm noticing a lot on these modern thin and lights is that there have not a whole lot of ports on them. At the very least, not a lot of variety in the ports. Ethernet is getting hard to come by on small form factor laptops like this. The laptop that I actually use is a System 76 Lemur Pro. Doesn't have an Ethernet port on it. Video outputs, yeah. USB ports even. A lot of the industry is moving over to USB-C. the Type C connector, which is great. And the Type C connector is a lot thinner than the Type A connector, which allows you to make the device thinner. You don't have to widen it to accommodate the Type A connector. But the fact of the matter is that even now, most of your USB peripherals are Type A. And so you often end up with a couple of USB-C ports, and then you can expand it with dongles. I would much rather have ports on the computer than dongles. So let's see what, in the year 2012, Toshiba was able to pull off in terms of ports on a thin and light laptop. So we'll start on this side, where we have Kensington lock and a USB 3.0 Type A port. This is actually the only 3.0 port on here. The other USB ports are all at 2.0 speed. Was 2012 after all. Coming around to the back, how's that for a nice I/O complement? We've got Ethernet, VGA, 2 Type A ports, HDMI, power adapter. Now this, I have to admit, I'm very disappointed by. Toshiba is showing an incredible lack of courage here, because not only were they not brave enough to not put a headphone jack on here, but they put 2, the cowards. There's a headphone jack and a microphone jack independent, as well as a full-size SD card reader. I'll take that dummy that I somehow haven't lost out just yet. And that kind of rounds out the I/O. So what we have is we have 3 full-size USB-A ports. We've got Ethernet. We've got VGA, HDMI, power, 2 headphone jacks. Well, technically a headphone jack and a microphone jack, and full-sized SD card. That's quite a lot of I/O in a laptop of this size. And you can see they did actually have to get a little bit clever with how they fit these ports on here. If you take a look at this, see how the bigger ports, the Ethernet and the VGA, they actually put little feet on the laptop and use those to make it thick or thicker to accommodate the extra size of the big VGA and Ethernet ports. But they were able to, with some clever engineering, get a very, very reasonable complement of ports onto this thing. And it boggles my mind sometimes to think about the fact that we were able to have this on this was a sub $1,000 laptop too. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't really expensive either. We were able to have this level of I/O right on the board, or we were able to have this level of I/O right on the laptop in 2012, and nowadays this sort of thing is not as common. I'll tell you what, I used the hell out of all of these ports, especially this. This VGA was really useful. I went to a very sophisticated science and technology university, which used VGA for all of the connections of laptops to the projectors and stuff. Yay, science and tech school. Anyway, that's the story of the I/O on this thing. And it actually, the story of how interesting this thing is continues to deepen, I suppose you might say, as we get inside of it. So let's open her up. All you need to get into this thing is a PH0, Phillips 0 screwdriver. And unfortunately, there is a TR7, a security Torx, right here in the middle. So you need a security Torx 7 or a TR7 bit, which is a bit of an obstacle. And this one in particular is also hidden underneath of a rubber foot that you have to remove, peel off and remove to access it. So this one screw here actually kept me out of this when I was in school and was interested in opening her up. Did not know that was there, and even if I did, I probably wouldn't have had the right bit driver to open it. In any case, let's go ahead and get this thing open. All the Phillips screws are the same, with the exception of the ones in the extreme corners here and here. I'm actually missing this one, which are a bit longer, and those are what hold the the hinge cap in place. Okay, there's the longer screw for the hinge cap, and on removal of that screw, the hinge cap will just slide off, just like that. Okay, that's all the Phillips taken care of. Let's get rid of the security screw. All right, security torques notwithstanding, once the screws are out, it is incredibly easy to get this thing open. It's simply a magnesium alloy casing here that is screwed in. There are no clips or anything, so it just lifts off. The only tricky bit is that it tends to hang up if you're not careful on the headphone microphone jacks over here. Those actually, if you take a look, these rings are part of the connector, and they're actually they protrude out into the case. So you have to push the case over those rings, or push the case off those rings before it'll open. Otherwise, if you just try and lift it straight up, it's going to hang up on that and actually start to bend the motherboard, or an I/O daughter board anyway, over here away, and try and take it with it. So you want to grab it on the other side and just tilt it up like this, and it'll open up. I found that's the easiest way to open this thing without damaging anything. And as you can see, there you go. It's just a nice, very lightweight, thin alloy body. Not plastic, it is metal. And no clips, which is great. I hate clips as a retention mechanism. All they do is make it so that you have a very finite number of times you can open the thing, and make it so that every time you open it, you run the risk of breaking it. All right, so we now have this thing opened. Let's run through some of the interesting internal aspects of this laptop. First thing you'll note, there is no battery. I have already removed that. It was swollen and all kinds of nastiness. However, the battery is simply screwed in. In fact, I'll cut in some footage of me removing the battery right now. That is significant because that's something that we don't see all that often anymore. For example, my current laptop, the Lemur Pro, has a battery that is glued effectively into the chassis. And that makes replacing it way harder than it needs to be. I'm not looking forward to replacing the battery in that laptop. Whereas here, you just simply unscrew it, remove it, plop the new one in, and screw it down. No heat, no prying, no risk of accidentally poking the thing and setting it off. None of that. It's way simpler to just screw the battery in. And it's not as though screws take more space than adhesive in reality. Anywhere the battery is glued in, you could just as easily have screwed it in if you really wanted to. It's just to save money, because it's cheaper to just use adhesive strips than it is to add additional bill of materials items for screws and add screw holes and stuff. In any case, battery's gone. The speakers are here and here. They're actually held in using the two screws holding the speakers in on each speaker also hold the battery in. The battery sits on top. So those are fairly easily replaceable, and they're both on, I guess it's one component. At the very least, they both are wired into the same connector on the main board right here. So if you needed to replace your speakers, you could take these off, unplug it there, and get your new ones in. The wires are taped down, but that's sitting underneath the battery anyway, so it's probably not even necessary to replace that tape. Moving on up the board, this white backing here is actually the keyboard. Now, having just finished a rant about gluing in the batteries, I do believe that this keyboard is glued into here. I've not removed it, but from my limited research, I do believe that it is glued in. But this is the keyboard, and I believe this is the keyboard connector right here. Incidentally, this connector is for the trackpad, I think. So trackpad's under here. This is the trackpad. This green thing here is the trackpad. And then the bluish one here is, I believe, for the buttons. And so yeah, that's all connected up together. So that would be, I believe, the connector for replacing the trackpad, if that's something that you wanted to do. Right here is the CMOS battery. It's a nickel cadmium. And as you can see, looking at this board, there's not a whole hell of a lot of space to cram a coin cell. I guess you might be able to work something out over here. But what the engineers at Toshiba decided to do instead, or whoever it is that designed this, I suppose it's a pretty big assumption that Toshiba designed the actual motherboard. That's not usually how that industry works, but we'll say Toshiba and we'll just go with that. They opted instead to put the batteries out here and then connect it in using a connector. So that's quite nice. We have a ribbon cable. Actually, this and this are two separate boards. So this ribbon cable, I suppose, handles the communication between them. I suspect that this big chip here is probably the what would you call it? The network chipset, the controller for the Ethernet port. If I had to guess, I haven't looked up that part number, but that's my uneducated guess. This right here is the chipset, the Intel chipset. Of course, we have the 2nd Gen i3 CPU right here, and the CPU cooler, which is also just screwed in. There's a screw there and a screw there, as well as the fan header right here, I believe. So that goes in there. And RAM is located right here. I mentioned earlier this computer has 4 gigs in a 2x2 configuration, and you may notice there's only one RAM stick. So this particular device actually has 2 gigabytes of RAM right here, these 4 ICs, soldered right onto the motherboard, and then it has a SODIMM slot for the second bit. So this is 2 gigs of soldered RAM and a 2 gig DDR3 SODIMM. I would rather see, obviously, 2 SODIMM slots instead of just soldered in a SODIMM. But when you're looking at a laptop of this size, I won't begrudge them soldering this RAM on. It makes it a lot easier to lay the thing out. And again, just like with the CMOS battery, I'd have a hard time envisioning where you'd stick the other SODIMM slot. It's a lot more space efficient to do that. But as you can see, they have managed to at least give you 1 RAM stick, which is nice. And I wish we saw that more often on more modern thin and lights. Same deal for the SSD. This is an mSATA 128GB Toshiba SSD. And again, it is not soldered onto the board. Funnily enough, I actually thought that it was. I spent, up until I opened this thing not very long ago, since I bought it, under the impression that the SSD was soldered. I was quite surprised to see it's actually not. It's a socketed mSATA. mSATA, I believe, is the predecessor to our current M.2. In fact, the connectors look kind of similar, although mSATA is a bit bigger. Personally, I consider having a non-soldered SSD that you can take out of the computer a necessity. I refuse to buy a laptop which has the storage soldered directly onto the board. I don't want to run the risk, even taking backups. Unless you're taking backups every time you save something, you run the risk of losing something if the computer goes down. And I feel a lot more comfortable in the knowledge that if my CPU dies, or all my RAM dies, or the chipset dies, or that random thing there blows up, that I haven't lost all my data. And I can just take this thing out and plug it into an adapter into a USB port, or plug it into a different computer and be good to go. I I won't buy anything that has the storage permanently soldered to the motherboard. That's just me. And as you can see here, it's not even necessary, which is just something that really drives me nuts. Is we oftentimes hear this refrain of, you gotta integrate it onto the board so you can make it thinner and smaller, and if you want the small laptop, you can't have these sockets. But and the sockets are big. Don't get me wrong. As you can see right here, 2 gigs of RAM soldered onto the board. It's a lot smaller than 2 gigs of RAM on a SODIMM slot. But this Toshiba laptop from the year 2012 made it work. And I find it hard to believe that modern laptop designers can't make it work either. Now, there is something else about the internals of this laptop that I find very impressive. And it amuses me to say that I find it impressive because it's one of those elementary level engineering things that should just be standard. But it's not. And so the fact that they bothered to do it right impresses me. And let me bring this up a little closer to the camera so I can show it to you. So this is the power connector. This is where the power plugs in, the charger. Now notice that the connector for the barrel jack is actually free floated effectively. And then it is connected into the motherboard via some wires into a little socket. Now, why is that significant? Well, most laptops that I have seen attach the power connector to the motherboard in the same way that this laptop attaches these ports here. So if you look, these ports have little tabs on them that are soldered directly onto the motherboard. Now, the problem with that on a port which is used very frequently, like a power port would be, is that as you plug and unplug things from that port, it's going to flex a little bit, right? And the problem is, as it flexes, that fatigues the solder, and eventually that's going to break. That solder connection is going to break. Especially if you trip over your power cable or something and yank on it really hard. This can cause a lot of problems. And in fact, it is, I believe, a fairly common failure mode of laptops is that the power connector just tears off of the computer. So by setting it up this way, where rather than soldering the power connector directly onto the motherboard, you run a wire between the two, all that flex is taken up by the slack in the wire. This is a non-rigid connection. It's capable of flexing. And so it can absorb all of that stress and not fatigue and break. And it has the added benefit of, if you were to somehow damage this thing, well, it's pretty easy to just unplug it. Just like that. And then you can buy this as an individual part and plug it right back in. Just like that. And there you go. I just replaced my power jack. Or my plug. My power socket. I don't know what the technical term for it is. So that is a far better system than just soldering the damn thing onto the motherboard. But that's what we often see. I just wanted to put this out there as an example of not done perfectly, but an Ultrabook done pretty well from many, many years ago. If we could have all of these things, the well-designed power connector, socketed components, a screwed-in battery, easily replaceable speakers, and CMOS batteries and stuff, if we could have all of this in our thin and lights and have them still be thin and have them still be light 8 or 9 years ago, I fail to see why we can't have these things now. Now, spinning off of this, I have 2 more videos that I want to do. First one is I'm going to take this laptop and refurb it. So there's a bunch of things that are wrong with it but they're all fairly easily resolvable. So I have purchased all the necessary components. I'm actually still waiting on one. The keyboard hasn't come in yet. But I'm going to replace the keyboard, the battery, the CMOS, and fix the hinge that I have that's broken on it, and get all that stuff, or fix the hinge is the wrong word, put on a hinge cover, and get this thing back into fairly good shape. So that's a video coming down the pike as soon as I get this keyboard in. We'll take a look at that. The other thing I want to do is I want to do a teardown / review of my daily driver laptop, my System 76 Lemur Pro. This is a laptop that is of similar size. It's actually a little bit bigger than this one, I think, in terms of overall thickness. But when I open it up, we'll see some similarities and some differences between them. And I wanted to get this as sort of a baseline for when we look at that one, because that one does some things well, and it does some things not as well as this one does. I hope that you found this interesting, and if you did, definitely stay tuned for those future 2 videos along the same lines. If you didn't find it interesting, fear not. Programming and command line stuff is still happening, and the next video will be one of those. I'm trying to mix these guys in because I find it interesting, but not to completely replace the software videos, right? Now, in any case, I do hope that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video, whichever that happens to be. Have a good one.